All right, so we talked about a few things. We talked about him referencing Lincoln, pulling in that ethos. We already talked about how he's setting this up as an important event. He uses phrases like go down in history. You have repetition of history so people know this is a time of change. All right, did we get into the second paragraph yet, or we just started? Okay. All right, so first off, 5 years ago, how many years is a score?
10, sorry, 20.
Okay, 20, so we talked about that.
Yeah, we're on the 30.
Oh, we are?
Yeah.
All right, I'm just going to run through some of this again just to get us caught up. So you got 5 years ago, connects to Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. The Emancipation Proclamation did what? Freed the slaves. Yep. Okay, momentous decree. So, momentous, yeah, diction. Could come back later. Great beacon light of hope. Yep, so you have your light metaphor. Millions of Negro slaves, that word's going to jump out too, who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. So what's that? Okay. All right. So then what is that? Seared in the flames of withering injustice. Think about just flames of withering injustice. What device is that? Metaphor, there we go. Yeah, so we have another metaphor there. And the withering injustice is going to be slavery. Came as a joyous daybreak. So again, you have light imagery. So in this first paragraph here, what is light meant to represent? Okay, light equals hope, freedom maybe. Yeah, so you can see he's kind of got a theme going in that paragraph. And it's also contrasting darkness and light, so you have the long night of their captivity. So let's put that over here somewhere. And sometimes we're not quite sure how this is going to fit into the grand scheme of things, but we just kind of make a note of it. And then if he comes back to this idea somewhere else down, then we can reference it. And then that kind of shows that we're connecting the pieces of the speech together. And you have that darkness is basically going to equal slavery. Really, slavery, any kind of oppression. Okay. All right, and then down in the next paragraph, we see this occur. So what's this an example of? You can see it. If you put all these together, all those that I underlined. Repetition, yes. So we have repetition. But this is a specific kind of repetition. Called anaphora. So look at your packets there. What is anaphora?
Repetition of the same word or words at the beginning of a successive phrase or sentences.
Yes, so repetition of words at the beginning of successive sentences. So you have the 100 years later, 100 years later, 100 years later, and the sentences are all consecutive. So when it's like that, it's called anaphora. So what's his strategy here with the repetition of 100 years later?
To emphasize the time.
What's that?
To emphasize the time.
Why is it important that he emphasize the time?
Because it's been so long.
Because it's been so long since what?
Since they were free.
Be more specific.
Since they've been slaves.
Wow. Okay. You're right. Free. I wanted you to say the Emancipation Proclamation just to tie it back to what he's already talked about. Yeah, because it goes back to the 5 score. So up here he's saying 100 years ago, but he's saying it in a different way to reference Lincoln. Here he's just flat out saying 100 years ago, 100 years, 100 years. So with repetition, what I want you to get to is when you're speaking to repetition, don't just say, oh, this helps stick the idea in their brains, because obviously that's what repetition is meant to do. But speak to the specific words that he's repeating and the effect it's going to have on the audience. So he's highlighting the 100 years. I'm not phrasing this right. 100 years. Oh, that's the wrong one. Okay. Mark that off. It's been 100 years since Emancipation Proclamation. And yet what?
And yet what?
Yeah, and yet what?
They're still not free.
Yeah, there's still inequality. So 100 years is going to seem like a long time to anybody. So it reemphasizes 100 years later, 100 years later, and the later lets you know it's a reference to the Emancipation Proclamation. So he's trying to emphasize it's been 100 years, and yet we still aren't truly free. So this will probably tie into his larger purpose here, calling that out. And then if you look here, there's some slave imagery as well. Where do you notice that in this same paragraph? Like what words?
An only island of poverty amidst a vast ocean of material prosperity.
Mm-hmm. So with that, it's kind of that leads back to the segregation. So it's like they're in the same area, but they're not a part of the community. If you're looking specifically for slave imagery, you have manacles. What are manacles?
Manacles.
I thought you were trying to answer me with the word. Okay. Manacles are like chains, basically. Chains you put on slaves, like handcuffs. So manacles of segregation, chains of discrimination. So you have slave imagery. So he's talking about them in the present, but he's referencing slave imagery to show that, hey, we're still basically slaves in our own country. There's still no equality. Finds himself in exile. So again, you have the idea of segregation, not a part of society. And then that last sentence there. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. What do you think that line is? Or what's it speak to? Speaks to the author's purpose. This is what we're here to do. He just flat out says it. We've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. And what's the shameful condition? Exactly, yeah. So the first paragraph, and when I say first, I'm talking about the first where he actually starts speaking here, the 5 score. He kind of sets up the Emancipation Proclamation as this beacon of light. It's going to mean freedom and hope. And then he basically shuts it down. 100 years later, we're still chained. We're still shackled by segregation. So it's almost like we're still slaves. And then he's going to switch up the metaphor here. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. So what's that make you think of? Cash a check.
Get paid.
Okay. So something's owed. When somebody writes you a check or gives you your paycheck, that's money they owe you. So it gives you the idea that something's owed. Also, you can see switched into banking metaphors. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, they were signaling a promissory note. So again, is giving you the idea that something's owed. It's like an IOU almost. To which every American, so all, including blacks, was to fall heir. What does that mean, was to fall heir? What?
Kinda like, it was like, they're all passed down.
Yeah. You're supposed to inherit it. So again, you have the idea that something's owed. We don't know what's owed yet, but he does reference the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. So we have somewhat of an idea. And then he specifically quotes unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is the something owed. Constitution and the Declaration are basically the foundation of our society. And the foundation of our society, it lays out these are what's owed to everyone. And he says, yes, black men as well as white men. Guaranteed, ties back to the idea that it's owed. This is really messy, but are you guys following it? It's hard to write with this thing. All right. Okay, so it's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. So what does it mean when you default on something?
Like you slack on it.
So if you default on your mortgage,
Oh, like no, you have not paid attention to, like, you didn't pay it.
you didn't pay it.
Pay it.
Yeah, so basically it failed to pay. So the beginning of the paragraph, he's setting up, okay, based on the foundations of our country, the Constitution and the Declaration, everyone, all people, are guaranteed these rights. And he says it's obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, this promise of freedom, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, I think sacred there is good diction. America has given the Negro people a bad check. So again, failed to pay, which has come back marked insufficient funds. Also failed to pay. So failed to meet the expectation of all people are created equal. All right, so I'm gonna finish up on this next one. I'm gonna set you guys loose on the rest. Are you kind of following his chain of argument here? Make sense? What we're doing, what we're looking at?
Yes.
All right.
I just don't know how we're supposed to annotate or like that. That doesn't make sense. Like we're supposed to take apart the passage like you are, like that.
So honestly, I don't expect you to already. I want you to get close to this point. Obviously, I've had more schooling and more practice with it. So if you're not at this level of detail, that is fine. I just want you to know that sometimes you'll look at something and see there's really nothing there. You'll think there's nothing there. But if you really dive in deep, you can mine gold from all these speeches. All right. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds. So we've come to cash this check. So again, he's continuing on with the banking metaphor. So before, up here he's saying, America's like, oh, we don't have the funds to pay you. We don't have the opportunity funds. But here he's saying, we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. Again, Bank of Justice would be what? What device? Yes, it would be freedom. If we're going back to our rhetorical devices, what is that? Metaphor, good. Vaults of opportunity. What would that be? Vaults of opportunity. What device is that? Metaphor again. So you can see there's a strategy here. He's using all these banking metaphors. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. So here he says America's refused to pay us the note, the freedom, but he's like, oh, it's not because the opportunity's not there. They just haven't done it. So we're here to cash the check. We know you can pay us. We know you can give us this freedom and this land of opportunity, vaults of opportunity. There's opportunity there. So we're coming to claim it, to claim what's owed, as stated in the Declaration and the Constitution. All right. So I'm going to have you go through, kind of go through the rest, look through that packet as well. What do we have going on here? Sorry, note.